Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's been on everyone's minds, climate change. But we're not just going to skim the surface this time. We're diving deep into the real-world impacts of climate change, specifically looking at agriculture, ecosystems, and even animal health. And of course, we'll explore how people around the world are adapting. To get to the bottom of all this, we've got a fascinating mix of sources, including academic papers and reports from organizations like the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. They all offer different perspectives, and trust me, it gets pretty interesting. All right, so before we get lost in the details, let's start with the basics. How do we define climate change? I feel like it's so easy to mix it up with weather.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to confuse the two. Weather is what we experience day to day. It's like that unpredictable friend. Sunshine one minute, rain the next. Climate, on the other hand, is more about the long-term personality of a region. It's the average weather pattern over a much longer period. We're talking decades or even centuries.
So climate change is when those long-term patterns start to shift, like we're seeing with the gradual rise in global temperatures.
Exactly. Think of it like the Earth's thermostat is slowly being turned up, and that's causing noticeable changes in weather patterns, like those intense heat waves we've been seeing, shifts in rainfall, and more frequent extreme events like floods and droughts.
And these changes aren't just natural cycles the Earth goes through, right? I mean, the Earth's climate has always fluctuated on its own.
That's true. Over millions of years, we've seen ice ages come and go, driven by natural factors like shifts in the Earth's orbit or volcanic activity. But what's different about what we're seeing now is the undeniable human influence. Our activities since the Industrial Revolution have significantly increased the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
Those greenhouse gases, they trap heat like a blanket around the Earth, right?
Right.
Our sources specifically talk about carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. What makes them the main culprits?
They're the heavy hitters, so to speak, when it comes to warming the planet. Carbon dioxide is the most abundant. It's mostly released from burning those fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. Then you've got methane, a potent but shorter-lived gas, and it's released from sources like livestock, agriculture, and leaks from natural gas systems. And lastly, nitrous oxide, a powerful warming gas, is often linked to agricultural fertilizers.
It's crazy to think about how our daily activities like driving, raising livestock, or even just using fertilizer contribute to these emissions. And the sources we have paint a really stark picture. They say that in 2019, global greenhouse gas emissions were 12% higher than they were just a decade earlier, and a staggering 54% higher than back in 1990. It really shows how much our impact has accelerated in such a short time.
It's a sobering reminder of how drastically we've changed our planet. And these rising emissions are what's driving that global warming we've been talking about.
So let's talk about those impacts, especially on something that affects us all. Human health. Our sources say that the World Health Organization predicts climate change could cause an extra 250,000 deaths per year by 2050, which is just terrifying.
It's a truly staggering figure, and the WHO estimate only takes into account deaths from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress. The reality is that climate change impacts health in so many ways, both directly and indirectly.
So it's not just those extreme heat waves we see on the news where people suffer from heat stroke then.
Not at all. There's a whole chain reaction at play. Changing temperatures and weather patterns can actually influence how infectious diseases spread. For instance, warmer temperatures and more rainfall can create perfect conditions for mosquitoes to breed, leading to a spike in diseases like malaria and dengue fever. And as sea levels rise, they can contaminate freshwater sources, increasing the risk of those nasty waterborne illnesses like cholera.
It's almost like a domino effect. One change triggers a cascade of problems. And it's not just physical health either, is it? Our sources also mention the psychological impacts of climate change.
Absolutely. That mental health burden can't be overlooked. Imagine living through a devastating hurricane or experiencing a prolonged drought that threatens your livelihood. These events can be incredibly traumatic, leading to anxiety, depression, and even PTSD. And the constant worry about the future of our planet can definitely take a toll on mental well-being.
It's like an invisible weight that so many people carry. It really shows how far-reaching the impacts of climate change are. You know, I was surprised by one detail in the research. It said that hospitalizations for hyponatremia, that's a condition caused by low sodium levels in the blood, are actually increasing because of extreme heat. I never would have connected those two.
It is pretty fascinating, isn't it? Climate change can have some pretty unexpected consequences. In this case, when you sweat excessively from the heat, and then overhydrate because you're worried about dehydration, it can actually mess with your electrolyte balance, leading to that dangerous condition.
It really highlights how complex the ripple effects of climate change can be. Sometimes the most serious impacts are the ones we least expect.
And it's not just us humans feeling the heat. Climate change is messing with our food supply, too.
It's easy to forget about where our food comes from when you can just grab anything at the supermarket. But climate change is making it harder and harder to actually grow that food.
Exactly. Imagine you're a farmer, you've got your crops all planned out, you're scheduled down pat, and suddenly the rains come late, or they're way too heavy, and your fields get flooded, or there's this brutal heat wave that scorches your crops before they're ready.
So it's not just about a gradual warming trend, it's the unpredictable weather that's throwing things off.
Exactly. Those shifting temperatures, the changing rainfall patterns, and those increasingly frequent extreme events, they all take a toll on those crop yields. And livestock are vulnerable too. Heat stress can affect them, the quality of pastures changes, and there's a greater risk of diseases spreading.
Yeah, the reports we looked at make a really important point about how all this can lead to some pretty serious consequences like food shortages, price increases, and ultimately hunger and poverty.
It's a vicious cycle. When crops fail and livestock die off, food becomes scarce, prices go up, and people struggle to afford even basic necessities. It can lead to malnutrition, social unrest, and even force people to migrate in search of food and opportunity.
It's a stark reminder of how interconnected everything is. You mentioned earlier how these impacts aren't the same everywhere. Why is it so important to understand the local and regional differences?
Because a global problem needs those local solutions.
Right.
A farmer in drought-prone California will face different challenges than, say, a farmer in Bangladesh, where they're more prone to flooding. So understanding those specific vulnerabilities is key to developing strategies that actually work on the ground.
One thing that really stood out to me in the research is how climate change just makes it so much harder to balance conservation efforts with the need to feed a growing population.
Yeah.
It's like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
It's a tough dilemma, no doubt about it. We need to increase food production to feed everyone, but at the same time, we can't destroy the natural ecosystems that sustain us. Climate change just adds this whole other layer of complexity, forcing us to make hard choices about how we use our land and resources.
So it's not just about growing more food, it's about doing it in a way that doesn't wreck the planet.
Speaking of the planet, let's talk about how climate change is impacting those incredible ecosystems we rely on.
This is where things get really concerning. Our research paints a bleak picture of widespread disruption across all sorts of ecosystems, from those lush forests and freshwater systems to the icy landscapes of the cryosphere, and even those vast oceans.
And we're not just talking about animals needing to adapt to slightly warmer temperatures, right? Our sources talk about irreversible losses, like local extinctions even.
Yeah, it's a tragedy. We're seeing this massive loss of biodiversity as climate change just pushes species beyond their limits. Some just can't adapt fast enough, leading to their decline or even disappearance.
The FAO report goes into detail about what's happening to forests, which are so crucial not just for the environment, but for the 1.6 billion people who depend on them. Yeah, forests are like the lungs of our planet, absorbing that carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. But climate change is putting them under immense pressure. Those higher temperatures, changes in rainfall, and more frequent droughts, they're making forests much more susceptible to wildfires, pests, and diseases.
And as those forests shrink, we lose the vital services they provide, like clean water, carbon storage, and habitat for countless species.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Sometimes it's those smaller stories that really drive it home. One of the sources focused on the monarch butterfly, and it was shocking to see how hard they're being hit by climate change.
Yeah, the monarch butterfly is this powerful symbol of how interconnected nature really is. Their incredible migration across North America is just amazing to witness, but climate change is disrupting that delicate balance.
How so?
Well, rising temperatures and changing weather patterns are messing with the timing of their migrations, and the milkweed they depend on is also being impacted by those changes in land use and pesticides.
It's heartbreaking to think that something as beautiful and resilient as the monarch butterfly could be threatened by climate change. It shows how no part of nature is safe from these impacts.
It's a reminder that even the tiniest creatures play such an important role in the web of life. And when they start to decline, it can have those cascading effects throughout entire ecosystems.
So we've talked about the alarming impacts on human health, agriculture, and ecosystems. It can feel pretty overwhelming. But our sources also point to some glimmers of hope. They delve into what we can actually do about this crisis, adaptation and mitigation strategies.
It's not all doom and gloom. We have the knowledge and the tools to turn things around. Mitigation is about reducing those harmful greenhouse gas emissions, turning down the heat on global warming.
And how do we do that?
Well, it involves things like switching to renewable energy sources like solar and wind power, making our buildings and transportation more energy efficient, and promoting sustainable land management practices that can actually lock carbon away in the soil.
And then there's adaptation, which is more about learning to live with the changes that are already happening and building resilience to those future impacts.
Right, exactly. It's about acknowledging that climate change is already here and finding ways to adapt our systems and lifestyles to minimize the damage and even find opportunities within the challenges.
One concept that really intrigued me was regenerative agriculture. It's not just about reducing the negative impacts of farming, but actually healing and regenerating the ecosystems.
It's a really interesting approach. It's all about working with nature rather than fighting against it. It's about mimicking those natural processes to create healthy soil, conserve water, and encourage biodiversity.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine a farm where the soil is teeming with life, cover crops are used to protect the soil from erosion, and livestock are allowed to graze in a way that mimics their natural patterns.
It's a whole different way of thinking about farming compared to the industrial model, where the focus is on maximizing yield, even if it means harming the environment.
It's a real paradigm shift. Regenerative agriculture recognizes that a healthy ecosystem is the foundation for a productive and resilient farm.
Another adaptation strategy that caught my eye was reforestation and afforestation. It sounds so simple. Just plant more trees, but I'm sure there's more to it than that.
You're right, it's not just about sticking trees in the ground. We need to do it strategically.
So what does that look like?
Well, reforestation involves restoring those forests that have been damaged or destroyed, while afforestation is about planting trees in areas where they haven't grown before. And it's not just about quantity, it's about choosing the right trees for the right places to make sure they contribute to biodiversity and ecosystem restoration.
So things like making sure you're planting native species that are well suited to the local climate and soil conditions.
Exactly. It's about working with nature and not against it. And it's not just about the environmental benefits. Either reforestation and afforestation can also create jobs for local communities in tree planting, forest management, and the production of sustainable wood products.
It's amazing how these solutions can have these positive ripple effects that go beyond addressing climate change. And speaking of ripple effects, let's shift gears and talk about something that doesn't get enough attention to them: the impact of climate change on animal health.
It's definitely an important part of the puzzle. Animals are feeling the heat too, both literally and figuratively. Climate change is affecting their habitats, food sources, and how susceptible they are to diseases.
Yeah, I can imagine the rising temperatures would be really tough on animals.
Heat stress is a big concern, especially for livestock.
Yeah.
It can lead to lower productivity, weakened immune systems, and even death. And as we discussed before, climate change is also influencing the spread of diseases.
So how does that actually work? I'm curious about the mechanisms involved.
Well, imagine a mosquito that carries a dangerous disease as temperatures rise. That mosquito might be able to survive in new areas, potentially spreading the disease to animals that haven't been exposed to it before.
Right.
Also, warmer temperatures can speed up the life cycle of the pathogen itself, making it spread faster and wider.
That's scary.
It's like climate change is giving certain diseases an advantage.
One of the sources mentioned leishmaniasis, a parasitic disease that can affect both animals and humans.
That's a perfect example of how animal health and human health are connected. It's spread by sandflies, and as climate change affects their range, the risk of this disease spreading to new areas increases.
It's a reminder that we're all in this together. What impacts animals ultimately impacts us too. So what can we do to protect animal health in the face of climate change?
We need a multi-pronged approach.
What does that look like?
Well, one strategy is to breed more resilient animals through targeted breeding programs.
So livestock that are better equipped to handle heat-resistant diseases and thrive on locally available feed.
Exactly, giving them a genetic advantage. But it's not just about genetics. We also need to improve how we manage livestock.
Like ensuring they have access to shade and water, making sure barns are properly ventilated, and adjusting feeding strategies to keep animals healthy in warmer temperatures.
Exactly. It's about being proactive and reducing the stress on those animals. Our sources also highlight the importance of having strong veterinary services.
Veterinarians are on the front lines when it comes to preventing, detecting, and controlling disease outbreaks. Right.
Exactly. They need access to the best diagnostic tools, vaccines, and treatment options to effectively protect animal health.
And that all circles back to the need for research and innovation we need to keep developing new knowledge and tools to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to climate change and animal health.
Absolutely. It's a race against time, and we need everyone working together, scientists, veterinarians, farmers, policymakers, all collaborating to find those solutions that are both effective and sustainable.
It's a reminder that tackling climate change requires a global effort. One of our sources emphasized the One Health approach, which recognizes the connection between human health, animal health, and the environment.
The One Health concept is all about breaking down those silos and recognizing that the health of every living thing is interconnected.
That makes perfect sense.
Climate change affects us all, and our solutions should reflect that interconnectedness.
It reminds me of another concept we touched on. Rewilding, this idea of letting nature take the lead in restoring ecosystems, sounds pretty radical in a world where we try to control everything.
Rewilding is about recognizing the incredible power of nature to heal itself if we just give it the space and support it needs. It's about shifting away from that mindset of control and dominance and moving towards a more harmonious relationship with nature.
So it's not just about protecting pristine wilderness. It's about finding ways to restore nature in places that have been impacted by human activities, right?
Exactly. It's about creating those wilder, more biodiverse landscapes that can withstand the effects of climate change.
What would that look like in practice?
Well, it often involves reintroducing keystone species that are essential for maintaining the balance of an ecosystem.
One of the most famous examples is the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park. It's amazing how bringing back just one species can have such a positive impact on the whole ecosystem.
It's true. The wolves' return caused a trophic cascade, which means that their presence as apex predators had a dominant effect on the whole food chain, influencing the behavior of elk, the growth of plants, and even the flow of rivers.
It's incredible.
It's a really powerful example of how rewilding can restore the balance of a landscape.
And rewilding isn't just about bringing back wolves or other big predators. It can also involve removing dams to restore those natural river flows or creating wildlife corridors to reconnect fragmented habitats.
Absolutely. It's about thinking big and bold, finding ways to create wilder, more connected landscapes that can support a richer diversity of life.
And it's not just about restoring the past either, right?
Right. Rewilding is also about creating new, more resilient ecosystems that are ready to face the challenges of a changing climate.
I love that idea. It's about letting go of that need to control everything and trusting in the wisdom of nature. And speaking of working with nature, another strategy that I find fascinating is agroforestry. It's like blending agriculture and forestry together.
Agroforestry is a really smart way to bring trees into farming systems to create multiple benefits. Imagine a farm with trees along the edges of fields, providing shade for crops, reducing wind erosion, and creating homes for beneficial insects.
Right.
Or imagine a silvopastoral system where trees are integrated with livestock grazing. The trees provide fodder for the animals while also absorbing carbon and enriching the soil.
It's like building a mini ecosystem right there on the farm.
Exactly. These agroforestry systems are more diverse and complex than those typical single-crop farms, which makes them more resilient to pest diseases and extreme weather.
And it's not just about the environmental benefits either.
Right. Agroforestry can also provide additional income for farmers from things like timber fruits, nuts, and medicinal plants. It creates a more diverse income stream and helps to ensure food security.
It's a win-win for both people and planet. It seems like so many of these adaptation strategies have that in common, finding ways to work in harmony with nature rather than against it.
It's a fundamental shift in thinking. Recognizing that we are part of nature, not separate from it.
Yeah.
Our health, our well-being, our very survival depends on the health of our planet.
Which brings us to a really crucial aspect of climate change adaptation, the need for knowledge sharing and capacity building. It's great to have all these incredible ideas and solutions, but how do we make sure that information reaches the people who need it most?
That's a great point. Knowledge is power, but only if it's shared and put to good use. Farmers, communities, policymakers, they all need access to the latest research technologies and best practices so they can make informed decisions and implement effective strategies.
I can imagine that access to information is a major obstacle for many people, especially in those developing countries where resources are limited and access to technology can be challenging.
That's where organizations like the FAO and the UNDP play such an important role.
How so?
They're working to close that knowledge gap by providing technical assistance training programs and platforms for sharing information and successful strategies.
It's about giving people the tools and knowledge they need to adapt in a changing world.
Absolutely. And it's not just about a top-down approach either. It's also about recognizing the traditional knowledge and practices that communities have developed over generations.
Oh, I see.
There's so much we can learn from the people who have been living on the front lines of climate change for centuries.
It's about combining the best of traditional wisdom with modern science to find those solutions that are both effective and culturally relevant. And we can't forget the power of storytelling. Sometimes those dry facts and figures just don't resonate as much as a captivating story that connects with people on a deeper level.
Absolutely. Stories have the ability to simplify complex issues, make those climate change impacts more relatable, and inspire people to take action.
So, sharing stories about communities successfully adapting to climate change, farmers innovating new techniques, and scientists making those groundbreaking discoveries can really raise awareness, build empathy, and foster a sense of hope. It's about shifting the narrative from despair to possibility.
Exactly.
It's inspiring to see how people are tackling these climate challenges head on. Instead of throwing in the towel, it's like there's this wave of innovation and creativity to figure out how to adapt.
It really is remarkable. The amount of ingenuity and determination out there is incredible. And there's a real sense of urgency pushing people to find solutions, especially when it comes to agriculture.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of agriculture, our sources really highlight the potential of something called climate-smart agriculture. It sounds almost too good to be true, like increasing food production, boosting incomes, adapting to climate change, and cutting emissions all at the same time.
It might sound like a lot to juggle, but that's exactly what climate-smart agriculture aims to do. It's about understanding that food security, climate change, and poverty are all intertwined, and the solutions need to address all those pieces together.
So finding those win-win-win scenarios where everyone benefits, got it. What are some real-world examples of this in action?
Well, picture a farmer in a region that's constantly battling drought. They could switch to growing drought-tolerant crops, which not only means a better chance of a harvest even when water's scarce, but it also cuts down on the need for irrigation, saving those precious water resources.
That makes so much sense. And I also read about farmers using something called conservation agriculture techniques.
Ah, yes. That's a whole toolbox of practices that work together to keep the soil healthy, use water wisely, and reduce the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides.
Like, what kind of tools are we talking about?
Well, one example is no-till farming, where you plant crops directly into the leftover bits of the previous harvest without plowing.
Interesting.
This helps protect the soil from erosion, keeps moisture locked in, and even helps store carbon.
It's amazing how something as simple as skipping the plowing can make a difference. Our sources also talk about how important it is to include livestock in these climate-smart systems.
That's right. Livestock often get a bad reputation when we talk about the environment. But when they're managed well, they can actually be good for the land. Imagine a farmer using a rotational grazing system, moving their animals around like herds of wild herbivores naturally would. This can actually boost soil fertility, help plants grow better, and even capture more carbon in the ground.
Nature really does have the answers, doesn't it? It's like
Yeah.
we just have to pay attention and learn from how things work in the natural world. Our sources also mention how research and development play a huge role in finding new and innovative climate-smart solutions.
That's key. We need to constantly push the boundaries of what we know, developing new crop varieties that are even tougher against drought, pests, and diseases, and then figuring out how to make those breakthroughs accessible to farmers everywhere.
So it's not just about the science, it's about making sure those discoveries reach the people who need them most.
Exactly. That knowledge transfer and building up expertise is crucial. Farmers need the right information, the training, and the resources to put these new practices and technologies into action. And of course, we need policies that support this shift towards climate-smart agriculture.
It's a big, complex problem that needs everyone on board, scientists, policymakers, farmers, everyone. One area I'm particularly excited about is the development of climate-resilient crops, using those cutting-edge breeding techniques. It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, but it's actually happening.
It's pretty mind-blowing, isn't it? Scientists are using tools like marker-assisted selection and gene editing to create crops that can stand up to those climate challenges. Imagine rice that can grow in salty water, providing food for communities facing rising sea levels, or a new type of wheat that's resistant to a nasty fungal disease, protecting farmers' harvests and ensuring a stable food supply.
It's like we're giving these crops a genetic superpower to help them thrive in tough conditions.
And it's not just about engineering brand new crops, it's also about looking back at traditional varieties that have survived harsh environments for centuries. They hold a wealth of genetic knowledge that can help us build even more resilient crops for the future.
It's all about tapping into nature's wisdom. I'm also curious about how digital technologies can help with all this.
Oh, the digital revolution is changing everything. And agriculture is no exception. We're seeing things like remote sensing, weather forecasting, and precision agriculture becoming essential tools for farmers adapting to climate change.
So taking those tech advancements we see all around us and putting them to work on the farm.
Exactly. Think about a farmer using a drone with special sensors to keep an eye on their crops. It can spot areas that need more water or nutrients, allowing the farmer to target those resources precisely, which saves water, saves fertilizer, saves money, and is better for the environment.
It's like having a high-tech scout keeping watch over the fields. And what about weather forecasting? How does that play into all this?
Weather forecasting is getting more and more accurate, which means farmers can get a heads up about potential droughts, heat waves, and floods. This helps them make smart choices about when to plant, when to irrigate, and when to harvest, minimizing those risks from unpredictable weather.
Wow. It's like having a personal climate advisor in your pocket.
Hmm.
So we've talked about a lot of different approaches, from rewilding and agroforestry to those high-tech solutions, and it's clear there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to climate adaptation.
You're absolutely right. Every place has its own unique challenges and opportunities, but the common thread running through all these strategies is the idea of working with nature.
Recognizing that we're all connected people, ecosystems, everything.
It's a shift away from trying to dominate nature to a more harmonious way of living on the planet.
It's about understanding that we're not separate from nature, we're a part of it, and our well-being is completely dependent on the health of our planet.
That's a fundamental shift in perspective that's crucial for creating a truly sustainable and resilient future.
You know, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into climate change. We've explored the science behind it, the impacts we're seeing, the challenges we face, and most importantly, the solutions that are emerging.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I think the biggest takeaway for me is that climate change is a serious threat, but it's not an impossible one.
We have the knowledge, the tools, and the creative minds to adapt and build a future where we can all thrive. And this isn't just about governments or big organizations making changes. It's about each of us doing our part.
Absolutely. We can all make choices every day that contribute to a more sustainable world, from the food we buy and how we get around to the energy we use. Every little action matters, and together we can create a wave of positive change.
It's about understanding that we're all interconnected and that our actions have consequences, and choosing to be part of the solution.
And remembering that hope isn't passive, it's a choice we make to take action and make a difference. When we choose hope, we give ourselves the power to create a future where both people and the planet can thrive.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new, that you have a better understanding of what we're up against, and most importantly, that you feel inspired to take action. Remember, even small steps can make a big difference. Together, we can build a more resilient and sustainable future for everyone.